Welcome to Spotlight. I'm joined today by Jim Carr, Chief Operating Officer of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and Lisa Hasegawa, Executive Director of the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. And they're both concerned with poverty issues and the wealth gap in America. Jim, let's start with you. How substantial is the wealth gap between African Americans and non-Hispanic whites, and why does it exist more than a century after the end of slavery and 40 years after the Civil Rights Movement?
Sure. The wealth gaps between blacks and whites is quite substantial. One statistic alone tells, I think, a very powerful story. Blacks on average have about $10 of savings for every $100 of savings for non-Hispanic white households. In addition, the earnings gap, blacks earn about 66 cents per $1 on average relative to the income of a non-Hispanic white person. And there are other gaps in terms of educational attainment, for example. The dropout rate for African Americans is as high as 50%, depending on the type of study that you're using to measure it. And there are other gaps in terms of adequate access to quality education. In addition to the graduation rate, the quality of the education that's received, the amount and quality of health care that's received, the amount and quality of jobs that are able to be accessed. And so these gaps in social and economic attainment exist across the economic and social spectrum. The reason they exist is probably something that many Americans really don't understand, and that is that despite the fact that slavery ended over 100 years ago, almost immediately after the end of slavery, a whole series of policies began to be put into place by the federal government against African Americans, specifically to stifle their ability to build wealth and gain economic mobility. And these practices started at the end of the 1800s, and they continued literally for a century after.
If I could just continue on from what Jim was saying, I think the majority of the disparities is framed as a black and white disparity, and there is a lot of variation in between. And I think that, you know, for many people in America, I think the perception and the stereotypes of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is that they are the model minority, that they are the ones who are the wealthier. In terms of looking at the data of our community in the aggregate, it tracks more closely to the non-Hispanic white community or the general population. However, the organization that I work with, we work in predominantly low-income Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are actually very integrated with other communities of color and in areas, though, in neighborhoods that are low income overall. And so the patterns in our community are just really different. And so going back to the data issue, our community is very bipolar, if you will. You have folks who are doing really well and folks who are doing not well at all. A lot of it has to do with the history of immigration policies in this country. So similar to what Jim was saying about the systemic and federal policies that made it difficult and were actual barriers to equal wealth creation and asset building. There are similar policies and federal laws that were in place for that impacted Asian Americans and immigrants.
What are some of the issues?
The alien land laws didn't allow Asians to own property. The Japanese American internment, my family was particularly impacted. We lost our farms in Southern California. We had strawberry farms, and pretty much none of that exists today. They came back and had to start from scratch after the war, after World War II.
Both of you, what do we do now to help close the wealth gap and make sure that everyone benefits from the assets that that the country and the federal government are going to be helping with?
Sure. I believe first and foremost, the first most important step is to help Americans understand how we need to pull together or we will fall apart. And what I mean by that is that the world is changing pretty dramatically, and the global competition that we're facing in the future does not look like the competition we had for the past century. We are now in a global economy, and we are increasingly in a knowledge economy. And those two things together present challenges. For example, countries that were not economic competitors of ours before are now major competitors. Take China, for example, with 1.3 billion people. We are the 0.3 in terms of population of their 1.3. They have already done an extraordinary job in taking a lot of manufacturing production from the U.S., but they're not stopping there. They are educating their population, and they are getting ready for game day on the knowledge front. At the same time, the U.S. has a much smaller population, and rather than getting ready for game day, we're actually falling behind. In fact, a speech that President Obama gave just this last week to the National Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, he pointed out that America is actually falling behind in terms of educational attainment relative to other developed countries. And in addition, the gap between people of color and non-Hispanic white households is growing. So we're falling completely, and the gap is getting worse. But here's an interesting point. People of color are the fastest growing population in America, and within 35 years will represent the majority population. How competitive we will be if that population is poorly educated, poorly linked to the labor markets, and not able to obtain economic mobility. How does that create a strong, robust America? All Americans need to understand we all need each other.
But what is the plan to get us to that, to the shared wealth?
Well, again, that's why I'm saying the first step, the important step, is to recognize that we need to do it, because if we don't recognize we need to close these gaps, then we'll continue to argue with each other and have these very fruitless debates. In terms of what are the policies to help us get there, I think there are some policy steps are first of all, recognize that working families need help right across the board, not just people of color. People of color need the same thing that non-Hispanic white households need. And so access to good quality, low-cost health care. This is something that has been lacking among communities of color for decades. It just so happens that middle income and working non-Hispanic white households are now facing that same challenge. The same thing on access to education. It's too expensive for most people, for most families. It has historically been out of reach for people of color. It's increasingly out of reach for even middle-income non-Hispanic whites. So we share those needs. We share the needs to keep jobs in America that pay living wages. We share the need to have reliable financial institutions that work on our behalf. So the first step in closing that racial wealth gap is to actually address the problems very seriously that are facing working all Americans. And then beyond that, then to look at these historic gaps and understand how we can drill down and provide specific support. And one example of a specific area would be education, recognizing that inner city urban schools where people of color tend to concentrate really need special help, because those schools have been so long underfunded and neglected that helping them, you can't do it with just a general policy. You have to have special interventions, because the problems are much more complex than just they need more financial resources.